So I have my handy little spaceship here, and as you can see, that is Singapore in 1965. It's a tiny island nation. It was unexpectedly expelled from Malaysia. It had virtually no resources, no natural wealth, no standing army, and the unemployment there was through the roof. At that time, it was even poorer than India. Most experts believed this country would fail.
Warning, calculating quantum coordinates.
But instead, as you can see, it evolved into one of the wealthiest nations on earth within a single generation.
This was a mud flat, swamp. Today, this is a modern city.
This is the story of Singapore. More importantly, it's a masterclass in creating something extraordinary out of nothing. And this same blueprint can even guide entrepreneurs today. Singapore wasn't built like a traditional country. It was built like a startup. Lee Kuan Yew, the architect of this transformation, approached nation building like a CEO scales his company. The principles he deployed to turn Singapore around are the same principles you and I as entrepreneurs can apply to build businesses. In this video, I'll break down the lessons behind Singapore's transformation and actually show you which parts of this you can take back into your entrepreneurial life.
This is my country. This is my life. This is my people.
Now, the intro of this video was made using the Intel Core Ultra laptops. More on that later.
Singapore's journey starts with independence, and it's a little bit of a complicated one. At that point, about 14% of Singaporeans were unemployed. The rest were kind of employed, but not really in a way that contributed well to the economy. And it was way worse than India at that time. The economy mostly relied on being the middlemen in regional trade. And that's a very risky thing, because unless you produce your own goods, you'll always be the middleman helping trade goods between different nations. Now, before independence, the British military was basically a lifeline for Singapore's economy. It is estimated that around 40,000 people were directly employed by the British forces. So when Britain announced in 1968 that they'd be completely withdrawing from Singapore, by 1971, it put Singapore under the threat of having even higher unemployment. So what Lee Kuan Yew figured out was that if they wanted to survive, they needed to do two things. First, they had to leapfrog the region and create trade relations with the developed world. They needed to connect with developed nations, and the path was to bring multinational companies, which is MNCs, to set up shop. At that time, just like now, MNCs weren't exactly seen as heroes. If you go to social media today and see the concept of India bringing MNCs from outside here, a lot of people think that there's the reputation for exploiting cheap labor and resources. It feels like colonialism again, which is why Indians and even Singaporeans at that time had an aversion to bringing MNCs. They're like, yo, this is exactly like bringing the British back, isn't it? But Lee Kuan Yew knew he had a problem to solve. So he couldn't be stuck in these theoretical debates. He had to put food on the table of 2 million people. Lee Kuan Yew understood marketing, and he realized that if he could position Singapore with first-class standards in public security, health, education, transportation, and services, it would not only attract professionals here to keep doing more of what they're doing to make more money, but also these MNCs outside to come into the city. He needed to make the place look good. They couldn't just be as good as their neighbors, they had to be better. They had to offer something extra to make it worthwhile for companies to set up shop. So the government played a key role in attracting foreign investment. They provided these MNCs with well-planned commercial estates, incentives, and even export promotions. Most importantly, they established good labor relations, which is what private enterprise really wants and allows them to operate successfully. One such example was the Jurong Industrial Estate. It was 9,000 acres of land with roads, sewage, drainage, power and water all laid out. In 1968, American semiconductor company Texas Instruments wanted to come set up a plant to assemble semiconductors, which was a high-tech product at that time and still is, and were able to start production within just 50 days. Soon followed another American company, National Semiconductors. Another one of these companies was HP. Every single story of how Singapore is so welcoming to MNCs brought the next MNCs. These stories traveled through the boardrooms of American electronics industries, and investments started flowing in. By the end of 1970, they had issued 390 pioneer certificates to businesses and also offered them tax-free status for a bit. This all sounds crazy. Why were incentivizing businesses so much? But all of that led to the economy getting better. This is the thing, right? When government offers subsidies or when they bring in MNCs, most of us don't like it in the short term. But it's always the better decision in the long term because it creates jobs. Those jobs create disposable income, creating more jobs for the next year of the country. So Lee mentions in his book that visiting CEOs used to call him before investing. He says that the best way to convince them was to ensure that the roads from the airport to the hotel were clean and full of greenery. So this was Lee's idea and it's so templatized now. So if you see any new airport in any new city, the distance between the airport and the hotels is always covered in greenery. You want to show new people visiting that this is a good place to come invest your money and run your business. But at that time, this sight was not common in developing countries. He wanted to show the world that Singaporeans were competent, reliable, and disciplined. He knew he had to market this as a skill to the rest of the world, and he also said these people are ready to do what is required by these MNCs. And sure enough, by 1971, just a few years after this massive effort had begun, the unemployment situation had been completely turned around. Even when the British pulled out and left 30,000 workers jobless, unemployment did not spike. And by 1997, Singapore had nearly 200 American manufacturers investing over $19 billion. The US became Singapore's largest investor, and the tech and manufacturing industries kept upgrading their skills and products, which helped raise wages without sacrificing competitiveness. But it gets better. Just a few years after they had dealt with unemployment, Lee removed any subsidies that were in place to protect local businesses and help them compete with MNCs. You know what every country does? They always give the local businesses more of a stimulus versus MNCs. They say, these are our own people. We should make sure that we stimulate them so they produce more things internally. But he understood something. He understood that if Singapore had to become a competitive first world country, they could not have subsidized underperforming businesses. But Lee didn't do this. He did not hesitate to let their local businesses close down if they were not competent enough. It's like the participation prize in a race, right? If as a parent you keep giving your kids participation prizes or keep letting them completely win races, when they actually go out in the real world, they're going to be useless. So Lee knew this, that if I keep stimulating these businesses and keep, patting them on the back, they're not going to be very useful when the time comes where Singapore actually has to defend itself globally. But of course, you can't let your local businesses completely die. So here's what he did, and this is genius. What he said was that when it came to develop new domestic industries, he picked the best students, then sent them abroad to study at the best universities in Britain, Canada, Germany, America. He made them work in some MNCs, and when they came back, then they were given the opportunity to start companies like Neptune Orient Lines, which is a shipping line, and Singapore International Airlines. He said, let's take good talent, let's send them abroad, let's make them really, really good, then bring them back and give them entrepreneurial opportunities and subsidies. These enterprises were not run like government-operated companies. It was made clear that they had to be profitable and not be at the mercy of subsidies or be shut down, again emphasizing the need for meritocracy. Both of these enterprises went on to become highly profitable businesses. By achieving all of this in a decade, Lee's government sent a clear message to everyone outside. We are fair, we're competent, we're trustworthy, we get marketing. Okay, so those were the economic decisions that accelerated Singapore's growth. But that wasn't enough. You can't achieve ambitious goals as something like Singapore without instilling certain values in your people. Whether it's a company or a country, it's all about culture. See, Lee believed in socialism early on. He thought, if you make 10 rupees, it should be divided equally among everybody. But over time, he realized that personal motivation and rewards were essential for a productive economy. Some people are lazier and some people are more motivated to do more work. Now, his goal was to give every citizen a stake in the country and its future. For example, one of the things is he wanted a home-owning society. He saw how poorly maintained and misused blocks of low rental apartments were compared to homes owned by proud homeowners. He noticed that when someone owned a home, they treated their home and to some extent their neighboring areas with care. If everyone would own homes, the streets would be clean. And he saw this, right? He's like, if somebody owned a home, they'd keep their house and everything slightly outside clean. Now, if all 10 people on the block owned their own homes, they'd keep the entire street clean. If the entire country owned homes, they would keep the country clean. Whereas on the other hand, if someone rents, They do not care much about their home, and they definitely don't care about the street. He was convinced that if everyone owned a home, the country would be more stable. When people own something, they take care of it. Now, the British government had started a central provident fund. It was a simple savings scheme for retirement. 5% of the wage was contributed by the employee and 5% was matched by the employer, and this would be withdrawn at 55. Quite similar to how it works in India. But Lee decided to expand this compulsory scheme into a fund that will enable every worker to own a home. In 1968, the compulsory savings in the fund was increased and the Housing Development Board, or the HDB, launched a new revamped home ownership scheme. With this, workers were allowed to use their CPF savings to pay 20% of a home's cost as a down payment and pay the remaining amount in EMI over 20 years. They created beautiful housing with different layout options, a community center, and a food court. The number of people who wanted to buy a new HDB apartment grew from 3,000 when it began to 70,000 in 1996. By 1997, the country had 725,000 HDB apartments, only 9% of which were rented out. The rest were all owner-occupied. If Lee had been more like a finance influencer and basically just been about renting, it would have been a very different set of streets that you would be looking at. On its journey to becoming what it is today, Singapore also had to deal with unions. Interestingly, Lee Kuan Yew himself started his political life fighting for unions as an advisor and negotiator. By the mid-1950s, the communists had gained control of most unions in Singapore. Remember, communism was on the rise at that time. Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam were all adopting communism. There was no way Singapore could attract capitalist Western investments without freeing unions from communist control. Lee points out that the consequences of unfair demands from unions were serious, including unemployment. Poorly thought out demands led to ridiculous situations, like cleaning workers deliberately letting garbage pile up right before public holidays to ensure they'd get triple pay for working on those days. If these practices continued, no foreign business would have come to Singapore. Lee insisted that union leaders must not kill the golden goose that lays the golden eggs. He knew that workers needed new attitudes. You can't work in a company and say, oh, screw you, pay me, that's your responsibility. He knew that they had to add value to the companies coming in. Pay needed to align with performance, not just time spent on the job. Singapore's government couldn't allow situations like those to jeopardize the country's survival. This problem with unions still exists today. Recently, the New York Times Tech Guild, a union of over 600 tech employees, announced that they might organize a strike on election day if their demands aren't met. These demands include a 4-day work week, unlimited sick leave, and leave to grieve if their pet dies. Remember, the average salary of a tech employee at NYT is $190,000. If the company accepts these demands, it would cost them $100 million more. These problems were dealt with head-on by the Singapore government. They laid out provisions for rest days, public holidays, work hours, and also made leave policies. They made it illegal for a trade union to call for a strike without holding an anonymous vote. This stopped the practice of voting by open show of hands, where those who didn't agree with the union were intimidated into compliance. This happens all the time. If you allow everyone in the union to show their votes, if somebody votes against the strike, the union starts bullying that person inside the union. When it's blinded votes, people can actually be honest. Because the government was able to make these tough decisions early, they avoided the entitled welfare mindset that many other countries have gotten into and were able to create a virtuous cycle of low expenditure, high savings, low welfare, high investment, where the people who worked in companies actually felt proud of what they did instead of constantly calling it exploitation and actually driving away the MNCs, which eventually leads to a worse country at the end of it. But none of these reforms would have been sustainable without Singapore's commitment to a clean and incorruptible government. Lee Kuan Yew knew that corruption would destroy the country from within. Nobody understands this as much as we Indians. Singapore was determined not to fall into the same trap. To keep the government free from corruption, Lee made a bold and controversial move. He decided to pay government ministers and civil servants competitive private sector level wages. Like, think about it, right? His rationale is simple. If Singapore wanted the best talent to run the country, it had to compete with the private sector. You want the best talent. You don't want them going to a private sector job and getting paid 5 times more. Low pay would only incentivize corruption by A, getting incompetent people to apply for the roles, and B, making bribes more attractive. He also understood that their highly qualified ministers would not stay in office for long if they made a fraction of what they could make in the private sector. They had to be extremely well paid. And this is the one thing that I don't understand about India, which is if you want the best people to be in government, pay them as well as the best companies would pay them. That's the only way you're going to get the best. And that's the reason why you end up getting incompetent people who anyway end up taking bribes and end up cheating the system to make more money. One more thing that Singapore did, which I think is very relevant to India, was that Singapore was able to create a sense of oneness among people of different diverse backgrounds. Crucial for a country which was very, very divided. Because see, Singapore at this time, there were no native people. There were native people, but this very, very small minority. Singapore was actually composed of 3 factions. The first one and the largest one was the Chinese. The second one was a bunch of Malaysians. And third was Indians. And these 3 just did not get along. So how do you create national unity when these 3 communities don't get along? They were able to get them to work together despite communal tensions because of their choice of working language. And that choice was English. So remember I told you Singapore used to have a lot of communal rights? A lot of that was dependent on language. The Chinese couldn't really understand the Malaysians couldn't really understand the Indians very well, and it always felt like there were 3 different communities. Even so, he knew that English was the best common language to use because it would prevent conflict. He knew that all languages had some sentiment associated with them. All regional languages had some sentiment. So he said, if we make the national language Chinese, some people are going to end up feeling bad. If we make it Malay, other people are going to end up feeling bad. So he just chose English. He said the best thing that the Britishers gave us was this language that nobody is passionate towards. No regional Chinese person or no regional Indian would go out there and defend English or fight for it. So the fighting was reduced. Secondly, it also happened to be the language of business. It was the language of diplomacy, science and technology, all the papers were published in it. So the fact that nobody was passionate about English and it was actually commercially valuable, he said, we're going to make this the language that all of us are kind of disappointed in, but nobody really cares about enough to fight about. If he had picked any other language, there would be communal tensions. Because of this, he also made all the schools change their language of teaching to English. Having said that, there were still some pockets where they encouraged regional languages so that they didn't become completely westernized. I'm speaking to you in English because I know you're not passionate about it. Because I know you're not going to get offended about it, and we can just get information transfer, which is what I do, as a content creator. I'm transferring information and stories to you. I can do it in a language that you're not going to attach your sentiment to or get offended by. Another one of the debatable aspects of Lee Kuan Yew's policies was the way he went after his critics. He viewed criticism not only as an attack on him, on his leadership, but also as a threat to Singapore's progress. He was one of the few leaders of state to legally pursue those who made defamatory statements or published misleading information, and would often use lawsuits as a means to maintain control over narrative. He believed that allowing false accusations or unchecked media freedom could destabilize the government and erode public trust. He felt that it was not in Singapore's interest to have every single policy taken apart and criticized. He knew that Singapore had a big challenge ahead of it, and he would have to make some unpopular decisions, like for example, getting the MNCs to the country, some of which the masses would not agree with. He argued against the Western notion of a free press, criticizing what he saw as corruption and bias in the media system of the Western countries. He believed that the Western press, which was often idealized as a pillar of democracy, was not without its flaws. It was susceptible to sensationalism, corporate interests, and of course, political bias. It's so easy to get a paid article out now. Imagine back in those times where things were far less transparent. These problems of cancel culture and trial by the masses are not new things. Today, it is almost impossible to reply to every criticism you face on the internet, but he went after everyone, almost everyone, who he thought might have defamed him. A lot of people debate whether he was too authoritarian, but at the same time, if you put someone in a position where the only way to prove your innocence is by suing the newspapers or reducing their circulation, people who wrote critical articles about you, you kind of also leave them with no choice. Having said that, some of his actions in the media were definitely borderline dictatorship, right? At the end of the day, we can all debate about this, but we are well aware of the effects of fake news on countries like ours as well, where during elections we don't know what to believe and everyone seems strongly biased towards their side of the story, I see how susceptible it is to bias because I know some of the people that stories are being written off and I know they're totally different in real life versus what the story says. So I've seen these differences to know enough that you should go and defend yourself and your integrity if absolutely necessary. Of course, there's a level of scale beyond which it doesn't make sense because there's just too many people saying it. At least with the media piece, my role here isn't to tell you whether it's right or wrong. I wanted to leave you with the story of Lee Kuan Yew and what it actually takes to take a developing country and make it a developed country. Singapore succeeded because they were willing to make unpopular decisions that a lot of people don't agree with. Things like renting, things like marriage. A lot of people don't agree with a lot of that. And he made these decisions for the long-term good of the country. They did not pander to the public just to win the next elections. They did things that would benefit the country. They realized that you can't have people who want to live their entire life in the union mindset. You cannot have people think that somehow, if we all band together, we will make money out of thin air. It only comes through enterprise. He also ran the country like one should run a business. From marketing to the economic policies to even with the way you deal with unions and the media. It was run like a company. It was run like a tight ship. Think about it. Making the roads green and filled with greenery for MNC execs to come see was a marketing decision. Almost nobody in the early days would bet on Singapore to succeed, but Lee proved everyone wrong by running it exactly like you would run a business. But the key takeaway from Singapore's success is not about the policies themselves, but the values that underpin them. Personal responsibility, meritocracy, integrity, ownership. Singapore thrived because its leaders dared to make difficult decisions. There were two reasons I wanted to cover this story, right? One is because it shows you how much of Singapore's success is by doing things that the masses didn't fully agree with at that time. And secondly, I want to show you how much of success is also having the courage as one person, Lee Kuan Yew, as one person to not listen to the masses and do what you think is right anyway. Right? And to show you that if you do what you think is right for a particular cause for a very, very long period of time, get the right people involved and really work hard to make it happen, then you have miracles like Singapore.
So now I'm super excited to tell you how we made this beautiful intro you just saw. When you see someone moving through an incredible CGI environment, you're actually watching two completely different things merge together. And let me show you how we did it on these Intel AI PCs. So before we even started filming, we used AI, specifically Stable Diffusion, to plan our shots. We typed in our ideas and it helped us visualize exactly how we wanted our story to look. Now the first real challenge is to analyze our footage and match every single detail of how the light and color hit our subject. This is crucial because it tells our AI PC exactly how to make everything blend seamlessly. But here's where it gets really cool. We're using Unreal Engine to build our world. It's incredible because it lets us see our digital environments in real time. The clever part is matching our virtual camera to our real one. We take the exact same lens data we used while filming and put it into Unreal. This makes sure our digital world moves and behaves exactly like our real footage. Finally, we bring everything into After Effects. That's where we composite all the elements together and add that final polish that makes your brain believe it's all one perfect shot. Now what's incredible is how our AI PC handles all this. With its specialized Intel Core Ultra processors working together, we can preview our environments instantly at cinema quality. Even with complex lighting and physics, there's practically zero waiting time. Now what's really exciting is how this tech is transforming content creation. These new processors aren't just faster, they're specifically designed to handle compute-intensive tasks that help creators like us work more efficiently. It's amazing to see how far we've come, from spending hours on manual edits to having intelligent tools that help us focus on what matters most, telling great stories.